The morning Georgiana Marsh arrived at Ashford Park, the Michaelmas wind came with her, carrying the smell of turned earth and the first cold edge of autumn across the gravel sweep. She stood at the door with a single trunk and a letter of introduction from Mrs. Fallow of the teaching agency, and Lady Dorothea Ashford looked at her the way a housekeeper examines linen for wear. Briefly, completely, and without sentiment. "She will do for Henry," the dowager said, turning to Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, as though Georgiana had not ears that worked. "A governess and nothing more. She is not to use the main stairs after the household assembles." What she did not yet know was that those words, spoken within the hour of her arrival, were the first of 3 times the dowager would reach for that particular phrase. And that each time she reached for it, the man at the head of this house was standing somewhere closer than Lady Dorothea supposed. Georgiana had been 23 years old for 6 weeks. Her father, a scholar of modest means and immodest ambitions, had left her a well-read mind, a particular fluency in Latin verse, and debts amounting to £11 that she had settled herself before she would consent to leave his house for employment. She had £40 a year from Lord Ashford's household accounts, which was a fair wage for a governess in 1814, and she had, as she crossed that threshold for the first time, absolutely no expectation of anything beyond the salary. That was the wound the world had handed her. Not cruelty, precisely, but the accumulated arithmetic of it. Her father had educated her past her station and then left her to negotiate a station that had no use for what he had given her. The season did not want her. The marriage market had not extended an invitation. She had learned, through the careful practice of 2 previous positions, to make herself useful and small, in equal measure, to stand at the edge of rooms rather than the center, and to want nothing that could be taken. Ashford Park was a gray stone house in the Derbyshire hills, large enough to be cold in all its upper corridors and warm only in the rooms where fires were regularly kept. Mrs. Croft showed her to a room on the upper east wing, neat and plain, with a window that looked onto the kitchen garden, and beyond it, a stand of beeches that had already gone copper at the edges. Georgiana unpacked her trunk herself. She placed her father's copy of Virgil on the small writing table, the spine worn to bare board at the hinge, and she straightened it twice before she could leave the room. Henry was brought to her the following morning. He was 9 years old, and slight for it, with his father's dark coloring and an expression so carefully neutral it could only have been constructed. He did not speak when Mrs. Croft introduced them. He looked at Georgiana's hands, then at the floor, then at the window, in that order, as though establishing the room's geography before he committed to remaining in it. "How do you do, Henry?" Georgiana said. He said nothing. She did not press him. She asked Mrs. Croft to have a fire set in the small schoolroom, thanked her by name, and pulled a chair beside the table. She opened the Virgil to a middle page and began to read aloud to herself, quietly, as though Henry were not there. After 7 minutes, she felt him sit down across from her. They went on like that for 4 days. She read. He listened. She did not ask him to respond, and he did not offer to. On the 5th day, she noticed him watching her lips while she read the Latin, and on the 6th, she set the Virgil aside and opened an English volume of Aesop instead, and his watching sharpened in a way she recognized as the beginning of hunger. The schoolroom had no library to speak of, only a shelf of primers worn through by some previous child's hands and a battered atlas that was missing the plate for the eastern coasts. Georgiana asked Mrs. Croft whether the household library might be made available for the purposes of Henry's instruction. Mrs. Croft looked at her hands. "The library is Lord Ashford's private room, Miss Marsh. You would need his lordship's leave." She had not yet met Lord Ashford. He had been in residence since Michaelmas, but she had encountered him only as a set of sounds. Boots in the corridor before dawn, the closing of a heavy door at the north end of the house, a voice in the hall below that was low and level and did not rise for emphasis. She had seen him once from the kitchen garden window, crossing the stable yard on a gray horse, his back straight against the October sky, and she had thought, "That is a man who has organized his life around the avoidance of certain rooms." She did not yet know how precisely right she was. The library stood at the house's north end, behind a pair of paneled doors that were always closed. Georgiana passed them each morning on her way from the east wing to the schoolroom, and she noticed, without permitting herself to dwell on the noticing, that they were never opened. A faint smell of beeswax and paper reached her in the corridor, the particular smell of books that had not been disturbed for some time. She learned from Mrs. Croft, carefully and without appearing to inquire, that Lady Ashford, Edmund's late wife, had spent most of her final months in the library, that she had died 3 years past, in the winter of 1811, of a fever that had taken her between one Tuesday and the following Thursday, that Lord Ashford had not opened the library since the week of the funeral, that Henry had not spoken at length since the summer before his mother died. Georgiana sat with this information for 2 evenings before she decided what to do with it. On the 3rd evening she knocked at the door of the study, which was a different room entirely, a practical room with maps and ledgers and none of the weight that the library carried. Lord Edmund Ashford looked up from his desk. He was 34 years old and looked it without apology. His face had the specific quality of a man who had required a great deal of himself and received very little of what he had wanted in return. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of sky before snow, and they settled on her with an attention that felt almost inconveniently complete. "Miss Marsh," he said. He had been told her name. She had not yet told it to him herself. "My lord." She stood correctly, her hands at her sides. "I wish to speak to you about Henry's education, and to make a request of the household's library, if you would permit me a moment." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She counted them. Not out of nervousness, but because the silence had a specific quality that she thought she should measure. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She explained, plainly and without embellishment, that Henry was intelligent and had the beginnings of a genuine appetite for literature, and that the primers in the schoolroom were not sufficient to that appetite. She said that she did not wish to presume on what was a private room, but that she believed he would read more readily in a room that was designed for the purpose. She did not mention his mother. She did not mention the 3 years of closed doors. Edmund was quiet for a moment after she finished. He turned a pen over in his hand once. "I will consider it," he said. She thanked him and left. He gave her the library key 2 days later, setting it on the schoolroom threshold without ceremony, the iron key on a plain ring. He did not come to the door himself. He sent it with a footman named Thomas, who delivered it with the careful neutrality of a man who had been instructed to offer no commentary. Georgiana took the key, thanked Thomas by name, and held it for a moment in her palm, feeling the cold weight of it before she put it away. If you have ever found yourself waiting for a kindness that arrived too quietly to announce itself, you will understand why Georgiana spent a moment simply standing at the schoolroom window before she did anything else. The following morning she brought Henry to the library for the first time. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his hand on the frame. The room was high-ceilinged and south-facing, which meant that the pale October light came across the shelves at an angle that turned the book spines to warm golds and browns, and the dust motes in the air moved slowly, undisturbed. There was a fireplace on the east wall, cold and clean, and before it 2 chairs and a reading table that still held a book left open, face down. as though someone had stepped out and meant to return. Georgiana did not look at the open book. She looked at Henry. He crossed the threshold. She built a fire herself, using the materials in the basket beside the hearth, because she did not wish to wait for a footman and disturb whatever was happening in Henry's face as he moved along the shelves. He ran his fingers over the spines without pulling any volume free, reading the titles under his breath, his lips moving. She heard, once, something that might have been the beginning of a word. They read together for an hour. She chose a volume of natural history with engravings, because the pictures gave him a surface to approach, and the text gave him something to ask about, without the asking requiring much from him. He pointed to a plate of an otter. She named it. He looked at the Latin designation below, and his lips moved again, and he looked at her. "Lutra," she said softly. He looked at the page. "Lutra," he said. It was the first word she had heard him speak. This was the moment Edmund Ashford heard as well, though neither of them knew he was there. He had come to the corridor with some intention she never learned, and the library door had been left 6 inches ajar against the weight of warm air inside, and the word had reached him in the corridor like a sound from a room he had been certain was locked. He stood with his hand near the door and did not push it further open, because the word and the voice that said it were doing something to the inside of his chest that he was not prepared for. His son's voice. 3 years of silence breaking over a word in a dead language, spoken in the clear and patient voice of a woman he had seen precisely twice, and to whom he had said fewer than 30 words. He stood in the corridor for a moment more after the voices inside resumed, and then he walked back to the north end of the house by the long way around, through the east passage and down, because he was not ready to examine what had just shifted in him. There are things a man keeps locked away, not because he has forgotten them, but because he cannot afford to remember them too often. Edmund's late wife, Catherine, had loved this library with an uncomplicated joy that he had never been able to share, because her pleasure in it was entirely outside his experience of pleasure, which tended toward the hard and the earned. After she died, he had found a letter on the writing table inside, begun and unfinished, addressed to him in her hand, and he had not opened it. He had placed it in his study drawer, beneath the accounts, and he had not opened the drawer more than was necessary. He was afraid of what it said. More precisely, he was afraid of what it did not say, of reading to the line where her hand had stopped and understanding that there had not been time for more. He had told himself, over 3 winters and 3 springs, that the library was underused and that he would address it when the household circumstances permitted. He had not addressed it. He had not, until Miss Marsh asked him, seriously considered addressing it. Something in the plain practicality of her request, in the way she had stated Henry's appetite as a fact rather than a plea, had made the closed doors feel for the first time like a failure of stewardship rather than an act of grief. Lady Dorothea arrived in the 2nd week of November with Miss Cecily Vane and a maid and 3 trunks, having sent notice of the visit by letter that arrived the day before she did. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, precise in her dress and in her opinions, who had organized her son's life since before he was born, and who took the evidence of his grief not as a reason to soften her plans, but as a reason to accelerate them. The girl she had brought, Cecily Vane, was 20 years old, the daughter of Viscount Harcourt, fair-haired and genuinely assured, with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once been asked to make herself smaller. Georgiana met her in the entrance hall and thought, with her customary honesty, that Cecily was lovely and that she had no particular quarrel with her. and that the dowager's intentions were clear enough not to require decoding. "My son's governess," Lady Dorothea said at dinner that evening, turning to address a remark to Cecily that was, by its angle, also directed at the footman and the woman refilling the wine. "A governess and nothing more, though I understand she has taken it upon herself to make use of the library." She said the last 3 words with the precision of someone scoring a surface deliberately. Cecily glanced toward Georgiana's place at the table, which was set at the foot, correctly, and said nothing. She was polite, at least. Edmund was at the head of the table, and he heard the remark. Georgiana, watching her plate, heard a particular quality enter his silence that had not been there before. The dinners of the following week proceeded along a pattern that Georgiana understood and refused to allow to diminish her. Lady Dorothea arranged the house's social hours so that the library fell within the period when the drawing room was in use, and the household assembled, which meant that Georgiana's mornings there with Henry were noted and not quite tolerated. The dowager did not forbid the sessions outright, because she could not, the key having been formally granted by Edmund. She managed instead with the more durable instrument of implication. But the library sessions continued, and Henry continued to open. He read the Otter passage aloud one morning, haltingly, with Georgiana's finger below the line and her voice ready beside his when he hesitated. He did not need her voice for most of it. When he finished, he looked up, and his face did the thing that faces do when something that has been held for a long time is briefly released. He laughed. It was a small sound, a single breath of surprised delight over a mildly comic illustration of an otter inspecting a fish, but it was real, and it was his, and it rang in the high-ceilinged room with a clarity that startled them both. Georgiana felt the sound in her chest the way one feels a bell struck in a quiet room. Edmund was in the doorway. He had come to the library with the account books, intending to use the writing table for an hour while Mrs. Croft aired the study. That was the reason he gave himself later for why he had been standing at the door. The account books were under his arm. His face, when Georgiana finally glanced toward the doorway, was not the face she had seen at the study desk. The discipline was still there, but behind it something was moving, the way water moves under ice that has begun to thin. He looked at Henry for a long moment. Henry did not see him. He was running his finger over the otter engraving with the absorbed satisfaction of a child who has returned to himself. Edmund looked at Georgiana. She met his eyes once, carefully, and then she looked back at Henry's bent head, because whatever was happening in Lord Ashford's face was private, and not hers to hold on to. He set the account books on the table, said nothing, and left. But he left the door open behind him, which he had not done before. The days that followed had a particular texture. Edmund found reasons to pass through the north corridor in the morning. He did not come into the library, but the door remained open, and once she heard him pause in the corridor while Henry was reading aloud, and she read more slowly herself, so that Henry would have more time to find each word without feeling rushed. She could not have said precisely when she understood that Edmund came to the corridor deliberately. The understanding arrived the way winter does, not as an event, but as a gradual acknowledgement that the temperature has already changed. He spoke to her directly for the second time at the edge of the kitchen garden on a Tuesday afternoon, when she had brought Henry out to sketch the copper beeches before the last of the leaves came down. Edmund was returning from the stables. He checked slightly when he saw them, and then continued across the gravel, and paused at the gate. "He is drawing," he said. "He has been at it since 2 o'clock," she replied. "He is better at it than he believes himself to be." Edmund looked at his son's bent back, at the small hand moving the pencil across the paper, and something in his jaw altered by a fraction. "His mother Drew," he said. It was the first time he had mentioned her. He said it the way a man says a name that is still tender, with the careful flatness of someone who has been controlling the pressure around a bruise. "He has her hand for it," Georgiana said, which was a risk, and she knew it. Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. He looked at her then, and the look was long enough that she had to decide where to rest her own gaze, which she settled on the middle distance, the copper beaches and the gray sky above them. "Thank you," he said, "for what you were doing with him." He walked on before she could find the correct reply. That evening she sat at her writing table in the East Wing room and looked at the worn spine of her father's Virgil for a long time. And she did not allow herself to name what she had felt at the gate. She had 40 pounds a year and an excellent Latin education and no realistic expectation of anything further. She had learned to want nothing that could be taken. She reminded herself of this with the quiet firmness of a woman who has had occasion to remind herself of it before, and then she blew out the candle and went to sleep. Lady Dorothea moved her effort to a higher register in the 3rd week of November. There was a dinner party assembled from the neighboring households, 8 families and their relevant daughters, with Cecily placed directly to Edmund's right, which was the dowager's prerogative as hostess to arrange. Georgiana ate in her room that evening, which was correct, and she heard the dinner's conclusion through the floorboards, the drawing of chairs, and the movement of many people into the drawing room below. She did not hear what Lady Dorothea said to Mrs. Fallow of the neighboring Fallow estate. But she heard the following morning from Thomas the footman, who had not been instructed to be discreet on this particular subject, that the dowager had called her a provincial miss with ideas above her employment, and that this assessment had been delivered in the drawing room in a tone just loud enough to ensure its circulation. Thomas relayed this information because he was a good-natured young man of 21 who was genuinely offended on Georgiana's behalf and had not entirely considered the implications of telling her. She thanked him and said nothing further, and she went to the library with Henry, as she had every morning for 6 weeks, and she read aloud from a new volume of natural history, a larger one, with a chapter on migratory birds that had illustrations Henry wanted to copy. The morning after the dinner party, Edmund came to the library doorway and did not leave after a moment. He came inside. He sat at the writing table with his account books, as he had originally intended weeks before, and he worked there while Henry sketched and Georgiana read. He said nothing. She said nothing. Henry, after an initial startled look at his father's presence, settled back to his drawing with an ease that told her this was not entirely unwelcome. They spent 2 hours in that configuration, the fire burning down and rebuilt by Thomas, the winter light shifting across the shelves. She noticed once that Edmund's pen had been still for several minutes while she read, and that he was looking at the shelves along the far wall rather than his accounts. His face in profile had the particular quality of a man who has returned to a room he had told himself he did not miss. She kept reading. He came back to the library the next morning, and the morning after that. The dowager did not fail to notice. Her calculation, which she wore lightly enough that only someone paying precise attention would see it, shifted in response. On the 5th morning, Lady Dorothea came to the library doorway herself, during Henry's reading hour, and said pleasantly that it was a fine day for the drawing room, and that Miss Vane had been asking about the prospects for an excursion to the village. Edmund looked up from his accounts. "I am occupied," he said. Lady Dorothea smiled with all the surface warmth she possessed and withdrew. That afternoon she went to Mrs. Croft. Georgiana did not know what passed between them. She knew only the result, which arrived 2 mornings later in the form of a sealed letter delivered to her East Wing room by Mrs. Croft herself, who held it with the careful expression of a woman following instructions she was not certain she approved of. The letter bore the Ashford household seal. It informed Miss Georgiana Marsh that her services as governess to Master Henry Ashford were no longer required, effective in 3 days, and that her wages through the end of the quarter would be remitted by the estate's solicitor, Mr. Dove of Derby. It was signed at the bottom, in the dowager's hand, though the seal was the household's. Georgiana read it once. She read it a second time, more slowly. She sat at her writing table for a moment, the letter on the wood beside the Virgil, and she felt the specific sensation she had learned to recognize over the past 3 years as the machinery of other people's arrangements closing around her. A tightening in the chest, a careful steadying, and then the long practice of deciding how to comport herself. She was not going to diminish herself in the leaving of this house. She had arrived with a trunk and a letter of introduction, and she would leave the same way. She went to the library. She brought Henry. She read to him, and he read to her. And she corrected his pronunciation of 3 Latin words with the patience she had given every morning session for 6 weeks. She did not tell him she was leaving. She thought he would need to be told gently, and she was not yet certain of the words. At the end of the hour, she went to find Edmund. He was not in his study. He was in the stable yard, speaking with the head groom about the gray horse's off foreleg, which had developed a tenderness, and he looked up when she came through the gate with an expression that shifted, slightly, at something in her face. She handed him the letter without speaking. She had brought it because she did not trust herself to report its contents accurately, and without a feeling that would have been unbecoming, and because she believed he ought to see what had been done in his household's name. He read it. She watched him read it. She watched the careful composure of his face do something she had not seen it do before. It stilled in a different way, the way stone stills when all the pressure below it reaches a point. He folded the letter and held it. He looked at her with a directness that had none of his usual measured quality in it, only the look itself. "Did you consent to this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I did not," she said. "But I understand the household has prerogatives I cannot override, and I wished you to know that I will leave without any difficulty." He held the folded letter for another moment. "Come inside," he said. He said it the way he said most things, level and without volume. But it had a different weight to it now, as though the level tone were being applied to something that was not, in fact, level. "My lord, I do not think that is necessary. I only wished you to know what had been done, not to cause you any difficulty in your own household. If Miss Vane is the better choice for your son's future, then I understand the logic of the arrangement, and I hold no grudge against anyone in it." He looked at her for a long moment with the gray eyes that she had learned, over these weeks, contained more than they presented. "Miss Marsh," he said, "you have spoken to me honestly on every occasion we have had conversation. I would ask you to do so once more. Do you believe it would be better for Henry if you stayed?" The question cost her something to answer. "Yes," she said. "I believe it would." He turned and walked back into the house. He did not tell her to follow, but he left the yard gate open, and she followed. He went to the library. Not to the study, not to the drawing room, but to the library. And by the time he pushed open its double doors, 3 members of the household staff and Thomas the footman had found occasion to be in the corridor, and Lady Dorothea and Miss Cecily Vane were in the adjoining sitting room with its connecting door open, and Mrs. Croft was standing at the far end of the passage with her keys. Edmund set the letter on the library's writing table where the account books had been, and where the open book still lay face down on the shelf beside it, the one that had been left there 3 years ago and never moved. He said, addressing the room and the corridor and the open connecting door with equal precision, "Miss Marsh's position in this household is not subject to any authority other than mine." Lady Dorothea appeared in the connecting doorway. Her face had the specific composure of a woman who has played a card she believes to be unbeatable. "Edmund, the arrangement with Miss Vane is entirely to Henry's benefit. You know the household requires a settled future. You know what is expected." "I know," he said, "what is expected. I know also what has been promised." He looked at his mother with something that was not unkindness, but was not capitulation either. "You signed a letter with this household seal without my knowledge. That is the last time that will occur." Lady Dorothea's composure held for a moment more. Then it shifted, not collapsing, but rearranging itself around a new calculation, and the certainty that had inflated behind her eyes over the past 3 weeks quietly contracted. She glanced at Cecily, who was standing just behind her in the sitting-room doorway, and Cecily, to her credit, gave the dowager a small and honest look that said she had known, perhaps, that this was a possibility. Thomas the footman was very carefully looking at the wall. Edmund did not wait for his mother's response. He turned to Georgiana, who was standing at the library's edge with her hands quiet at her sides, and her face arranged in the careful composure she had learned over years of standing at the edges of rooms that were not hers. He said, "I would like to speak to you plainly." She said, "I would prefer that to any other manner." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the library felt larger than it was, and smaller than it was, at the same time. The way rooms feel when what is happening in them is too significant for the architecture to quite contain. "I have been told," he said, "by several people and in several ways, that I am a man who does not feel things. My mother believes it. I had, until recently, almost come to believe it myself." He was looking at her steadily, the gray eyes with their full and inconvenient attention. "I find that I do not believe it at all. I find that I feel a great deal, most of it occasioned in the past 6 weeks, and that it is only sensible to say so," Georgiana said, with the honest directness that only arrived when her values were pressed. "You should be aware that I have £40 a year, and no expectations, and a copy of Virgil that belongs to no library but my own." "I am aware," he said. "I am asking whether, if permitted, you would consider staying. Not as governess. In whatever capacity you would find acceptable." The connecting door to the sitting room had gone very still. "I would consider it," she said. She would not have said yes more extravagantly than that. She was a woman who had learned not to claim what had not yet been given. But she said it with the warmth that lived underneath her composure, the warmth she had been careful with for years. And it reached him. She could see it reach him, in the slight change in his jaw, and the long breath he took that was not quite controlled. He picked up the open book from the shelf beside the writing table, the one that had been lying face down for 3 years. He turned it over in his hands. It was a volume of poems, slim and worn, with a pressed flower laid flat between 2 pages, pressed so long it had gone translucent. He set it down again gently. He did not open it. Not yet. If that particular thread of this story moved something in you, leave a word in the comments, because it moved something in the writing of it too, and then come back for the rest. Lady Dorothea departed for the Dower House 5 days later. Not in disgrace, because Edmund did not manage his household with disgrace, but in the quiet rearrangement of understanding that occurs when a person of genuine intelligence encounters an outcome they had not built their logic around. She kissed Henry's head before she went, and she said to Georgiana in the entrance hall with the trunks being loaded, "You read Latin." It was not entirely a compliment and not entirely a concession, but it was honest, which was more than the dismissive label had been. Miss Cecily Vane departed the same morning with her maid and her 3 trunks, and a cordiality that cost her nothing, because she was genuinely confident and did not require the outcome she had been brought to secure. She told Henry that he drew very well, and Henry said, clearly and without hesitation, "Thank you, Miss Vane." Lady Dorothea, already on the step, heard it. Something crossed her face too quickly to name. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the weeks before. Edmund came to the library in the mornings, not with account books, but without particular business. And he sat at the writing table, and sometimes read, and sometimes watched. Henry read, and sometimes watched Georgiana correct Henry's pronunciation of the Latin names in the natural history volume. He did not declare himself again, having said what he said in the plainest terms he possessed, and she did not require him to. They were 2 people who had been given, somewhat unexpectedly, the chance to be in the same room without the architecture of obligation, requiring one of them to be invisible. He told her about Catherine on a gray afternoon in the 2nd week of December, sitting beside the fire with Henry dozing in the chair across from them. He told her the way he did most things that cost him, with discipline and precision, and without asking for anything in return for the telling. Catherine had been 27 when she died. She had been kind, and she had loved this room. And he had failed to understand, until far too late, that her particular quality of quietness was not contentment, but the careful management of a sorrow she had not known how to share with him. The letter on his desk was the evidence of that sorrow, begun and unfinished, and addressed to him. He had never opened it, because he was afraid the last line would make clear she had known she was dying, and had chosen to spare him the knowledge, which would mean she had spent her final days protecting him from grief, rather than letting him sit beside her in it. Georgiana listened to this, without moving. When he finished, she said, "You cannot know what the last line says until you have read it. And not reading it does not change what it says." It was the kind of sentence her father would have approved of. Plain and undecorated, and entirely precise. Edmund looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "It does not." He did not open the letter that evening. He opened it 3 days later, early in the morning before anyone was awake, sitting alone in the study. Georgiana knew because he came to the library afterward with a specific quality of stillness she had not seen before, a stillness that was rested rather than held. And he sat for a long time at the writing table with his hands quiet on the wood. She read to Henry and did not ask. That evening, at the library fire, he told her only that Catherine had been afraid he would blame himself for not sitting with her, and had written to say he should not. That she had wanted him to find his way back to ordinary life, which, she had written, was where she would have liked more time herself. He said this plainly. His voice was level, and his hands were still. Georgiana looked at the fire and felt the warmth of it on her face, and thought that grief, when it has been honorably kept, deserves to be set down as honorably. She was right, Georgiana said quietly, that ordinary life is worth finding one's way back to. He looked at her across the fire, and she met his eyes, and neither of them looked away for a long time. The snow came on the 14th of December, beginning in the night, and still falling when Henry woke and went to his window and shouted, without any management of his volume whatsoever, that the kitchen garden was buried. He appeared in the library doorway at 7 in the morning, still in his nightclothes, with his hair disordered, and the natural history volume under his arm already open to the plate of the Arctic fox, whose habitat, he had recently learned, involved conditions that closely resembled the kitchen garden currently visible from the south window. Georgiana was already there. She had come early, as she often did, because the morning library with its fire and its shelves and its south-facing light had become, over the weeks since the dismissal letter, something that felt like hers, in the way that spaces feel like yours when someone has given you leave to inhabit them fully. Edmund came down an hour later. He brought 3 cups of chocolate from the kitchen himself, carried carefully on a tray, which Thomas would have done in an instant, but which Edmund did himself with the deliberate attention of a man learning how to be in an ordinary room. He set a cup at Henry's elbow without interrupting the reading, and a cup at Georgiana's, and kept the third for himself. Henry was reading aloud, not haltingly, not with the careful word-by-word negotiation of 6 weeks ago, but reading. The sentences gathering themselves and flowing forward with a confidence that was real because it had been built from actual ground. He was reading from the Aesop, the fable of the fox and the crow, which he had chosen himself that morning from the shelf, and he read it with a particular attention to the crow's dialogue that suggested he found the crow's vanity genuinely comic. When he finished, he laughed again, the same small, bright sound she had first heard over the otter engraving, and this time Edmund laughed with him, a quiet sound, briefly unguarded, and Henry looked up at his father with an expression of absolute surprise, and then absolute pleasure, as though his father's laugh were a thing he had been waiting to hear for longer than he could have put into words. Georgiana looked at the fire and did not trust her face for a moment. Edmund looked at her. He reached across the corner of the writing table and covered her hand with his, briefly and without fanfare, his hand warm from the chocolate cup and deliberate in its settling. She turned her hand under his and held it. Henry, already moving to the window to assess the snow's progress with the authority of a 9-year-old boy who had decided that the kitchen garden's transformation was his to document, did not appear to notice. Or perhaps he noticed entirely and found it correct, and moved to the window so that they might have a moment in which being seen was not necessary. The slim volume of poems still stood on the shelf where Edmund had replaced it, the pressed flower between its pages. The Virgil was on the writing table beside Georgiana's cup, its worn spine to the room. The fire burned. The snow fell on the kitchen garden and the copper beeches and the gravel sweep, muffling the particular kind of silence that had lived in this house for 3 years into something that was only quiet rather than empty. Henry's voice carried across from the window. The beeches have gone completely white. Miss Marsh, come and see. She rose. She crossed to the window and stood beside him in the white light, and Edmund came to stand on his other side, and the 3 of them looked out at the kitchen garden, buried in the first snow of the winter of 1814, and Henry pressed his nose to the glass with an absolute absence of dignity, and laughed again. Ashford Park was a house that had been cold in all its upper corridors and warm only in the rooms where fires were regularly kept. She understood, standing at that window, that she had found her way into the warm room. She was home. If Georgiana's story found you somewhere you needed to be found, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest. And if you would like more stories told in this way, this channel keeps the fire burning, and there is always room at the reading table.